We've had a sporting theme recently, Jack. We spoke about farming Olympics, haven't we, recently?
We have.
So taking that on, Premier League season has started.
Yes.
You're into your fantasy football and got a fantasy football team. What if you had the same thing of farming and farmers? Who would your fantasy football farmers be?
I tell you what, someone, and I'm going to nerd out a little bit here, who I do follow a little bit their YouTubing. I think you'd have to put Ollie Blogs Harrison up front just for his commitment every day for like the last 5 years or something. He's going out there and he's doing a YouTube video.
The model pro.
But then likewise, probably a solid midfielder because he only goes twice a week on YouTube. It's Tom Pemberton. So you've got one arable farmer, one dairy farmer, both from the northwest powerhouse of fantasy farming football.
Yeah.
And the powerhouse of the Premier League. Now, hopefully, now we've name dropped them, they'll use their channels to plug Agonomics.
Hello, I'm David Udall, the David in Agonomics with David and Jack.
And I'm Jack Watts, the other fella in the title of this podcast.
We're both economists at AHDB, and the aim of our show is to throw the spotlight on some of our work to make the economics side of agriculture easier to understand.
The two go hand in hand, and who knows, that extra knowledge could help us all work a little bit smarter.
This week we're looking at dairy and grass growth, which remains quite topical, especially after the wet start that we had to the year.
Katie Evans is here to talk about the physical side of things, like grass quality.
And we're also joined by another of our colleagues, Susie Stannard, to look at how it's impacting dairy production.
And thanks to some podcasting wizardry, we'll have the latest market report relevant to whenever you've decided to listen to this show.
Please follow or subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode.
New shows drop every Wednesday at midday, and please get in touch.
Comment on any of AHDB's social channels.
Or email us agonomics@ahdb.org.uk. August is often can be quite quiet, but actually there's quite a lot going on at the moment. So we've got an exciting project going on in the beef and lamb side of things. So we are working on what we've dubbed Project 2030, which is looking at a range of bits of analysis that are looking at, well, what does the supply side of beef and lamb look like over the next few years? We've got lots of economic factors kicking off. So it's been really pleasing to be involved with that with our livestock colleagues. So be on the lookout for that over the next few weeks. Unfortunately, we have got some volatility coming back into markets. And I'm going to say that I think inflation is probably going to be a little bit of a topic we're going to start to hear more and more about as we've seen the unfolding of the conflict in Ukraine with developments there. We have seen the gas price over the last month going up by 20%, and that has quite big implications. Nothing like the levels we saw sort of back in mid-22, but it is bringing some volatility back into the market. And so just a few things kicking off on the outset of that, and it just points to, I think, some more challenges coming back into the industry.
So we had a nice tweet the other day from our friends at Ames saying their lesson for the day. If you work in the livestock industry and AHDB Agonomics podcast says it's going to be on cereals, then don't switch off because topics covered included deforestation and scope 3 emissions. Excellent as ever. Because we do kind of cover a lot of different topics. So even if it's got one thing on the front of it, we're going to go into some other areas as well.
Absolutely. And it points to the fact that a lot of agriculture is circular and interconnected. Whilst not an email sent into Agonomics, here is a recent request from one of our into the media team, and it starts, I have been tasked, brackets volunteered, with the production of the head for a Christmas pantomime cow. My wife has been volunteered to make the body. I should be grateful if you could help, either with plans to make the head or in any other way. I look forward to hearing from you. And I think that's probably one of the most bizarre emails I've seen coming in. And I guess someone must have plans or a blueprint for a pantomime cow.
The real question here actually is, what breed of cow are you going for? Because I'm imagining they're just going classic Frisian, whereas actually really the conversation should be, what cow are you aiming for, to then know what we should be giving advice for here.
That's a good point.
And as always, we've both got a mystery word, phrase or thing that has no right to be in a podcast about agriculture or economics to slip in somewhere. And I think we did okay last week. I think we did all right. I think I know I'm getting better. I still think it's rigged. I'm getting the more difficult words, but I think I'm getting better at guessing them. So we're going to go straight into the detail now. And as we said earlier on, we're here to talk about the dairy markets and about grass growth. And we're going to talk about our Forage for Knowledge tool and information in a moment. But first, we're going to welcome Katie Evans to the podcast. So welcome, Katie. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me along to the podcast. So my name is Katie Evans. I'm one of the senior engagement managers, actually on the beef and lamb team. But as you touched on already, and the interconnectedness of our sectors, I work across the dairy sector too, in supporting them with their grassland projects, such as Grass Check and what we're here today to talk about, our Forage for Knowledge. So Forage for Knowledge is managed and operated solely by AHDB. And as part of it, we set up a network of 27 dairy farmers across Great Britain. Each contributor submits a sample for analysis on a bi-weekly basis and submits their grass measures to AgriNet on a weekly basis then. And then this allows us to track how grass growth and crop quality has been across the season. It also allows us to see how it has varied through the years and its effects by different weather patterns on the growth and quality aspects of it. But ultimately, the aim of Forage for Knowledge is really to get a better understanding of grass production across these commercial farms. And as I've already mentioned, over the years, we have built a data set that has captured the grass growth and the quality across the seasons. This has really helped us to identify what are the big factors contributing to grass growth on those farms. And once we have that information, then we can start to dig down and determine what the limiting factors might be on farms during that period. We can provide not only the Forage for Knowledge network, but the industry then with advice and solutions, signposts to resources and tools that will help them during that specific period, whether it's drought or wet weather, or even just advice during the silage season.
So you mentioned actually what I was going to ask there about wet weather. And obviously, we've seen that prolonged period of wet weather, and earlier in the year, a lot of the headlines were being taken up by the impact on crops and the inability to sow crops and the poor condition. But obviously, if crops are in a poor condition, then grass growth is also in a poor condition. So what's the impact of that wet weather been this season? And have we seen a catch up in that grass growth as the weather has dried and we've actually hit a period of summer eventually?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say this year has been challenging. We seem to say that though most years, although last year we had a good grass growth season. There are times, there's no normal trend to the year anymore. And we're seeing that in our grass growth curve. It is changing. But when we look back through the Forage for Knowledge data and we look back through the weather that we experienced during that time, if we look, for example, at March, we saw that the rainfall figures were similar to 2023 figures, and the temperature was only slightly higher. Grass growth took off similar to previous years, but when we hit April, we saw an increase in rainfall of 22 millimeters, and the temperature, despite staying slightly higher, the persistent wind really hampered growth, with the average growth at 40 kg of dry matter per hectare per day. Farm average covers varied widely, and this really, for our farmers, I suppose, indicated the need to kind of adapt those rotations, their plans for the spring. They needed to be able to respond to the weather conditions that they were being faced with. And then when we got to the end of April, we saw even grass growth was over 20 kg of dry matter per hectare per day behind previous year's figures. When we got to May, rainfall was actually up 33 millimeters compared to 2023. But growth increased because of those cold winds. They'd eased off. Going into June, we saw a decrease in rainfall, and we saw the temperatures increasing, and we saw strong growth off the back of that. Rotations picked up, but we did notice a bit of quality drop off there. And when we're talking about that quality drop off, we're really seeing that in the crude protein side of things, and also in our ME. You also have the challenge then of trying to balance dry matter intakes and actually meeting livestock requirements and trying to manage and bank grass so that you have surplus. You're not having to feed concentrates or silage early from the clamp. It has been a challenging start to the season, and a lot of our farmers needed that extra bit of support from our resources and tools. And that's something that we try to address with our weekly newsletter, Forage for Knowledge newsletter. That goes out to just over 10,000 subscribers each week. These are levy payers who have subscribed, and they then get an update on all grass growth figures and quality. And they also get some tailored recommendations and advice from pasture to profit consultant Pierce Badnell. But overall, August looks good. Growth and average covers are promising, and keeping an eye towards maximising the upcoming autumn flush. So continuing with the strategic management will be key to maintaining those positive trends and preparing for that seasonal transition now into the closing period.
You kind of mentioned the autumn flush there, Katie, of grass growth, and kind of looking a bit further forwards. The impact of what we see now definitely carries on throughout all of those seasons. This grass growth isn't just for those individual points in time. It kind of links into forage availability, and that carries through the winter, etc. So what would your, I suppose, key points of advice be for those farmers that are now looking forwards, thinking of autumn, winter, forage, etc., and planning further forwards?
It's tricky. It is, like we see this year, some people didn't get the silage stocks that they wanted, they anticipated. Early cuts were delayed. We still have good growth coming into the autumn, but again, they're looking and compromising on possible quality there. The other challenge is maize. Maize is a crop this season is delayed due to the wet spring conditions. And this is really leading to the concerns around not just yield, but maturity and starch content and the overall quality of, but for that buffer feed, bringing that in for the housing period. So contingency plans are a big part of this, and what a lot of farmers will be facing in the coming weeks is looking at, because of the late harvest and the low yield, what plans can we put in place to safeguard, or they can put in place to safeguard themselves in the coming months. Another really important aspect that needs to be taken into consideration is the feed budgeting and ensuring that you get that right going into 2025. Again, depending on the growth rates that we're going to see coming into autumn, some farmers will start building covers now between August and September.
I kind of sound like a bit of a broken record about this, because I think it's pretty much every podcast that I keep on referencing back to this, but you've mentioned a lot in there about planning and I suppose getting into the detail. And this comes back to what we were talking about a few weeks ago, about those kind of top characteristics of the high-performing farms, that those that understand the detail, have the planning and the structure, and that, you know, looking at those key things that impact their businesses, they're the ones that sort of stand out in that high-performing sense. But it comes again back to time and time management. That's the critical thing of being able to take all of these factors and having the time from a farmer perspective to be able to actually firstly understand them and then implement changes in your business and then be able to measure those changes. This is another one of those real technical things that we need to get right.
It is, definitely. And it's that flexibility it gives you and the time that it gives you to adapt. When you can see something coming down the road, maybe 7-10 days ahead, you can start putting those plans in place.
It's another one probably of the unsung things that go on, but you know, grass is a huge economic resource of this industry. I always go back to when I was in New Zealand 20 years ago, and just the obsession of measuring grass, of budgeting your grass. If you pulled your cows out of the paddock too early, you got an absolute rollicking from your manager because you left too much cover in the field. That was it was a huge culture shock for me about just how important that grazed grass was to the performance of that business. And it's great to see that back here we're adapting that focus, we're driving that focus, and we're not taking an oversimplified approach to grass and just think it's something there that grows or it's a free resource. It's not. It's an economic resource, and it's a really important one to our competitiveness as to our livestock producing sectors.
Definitely. Whether you live on Orkney or on the Old Kent Road, it's always important to understand what is driving your grass growth. Thank you, Katie. That was really interesting to get into something which personally I don't know a huge about, and I've learned something there about the Forage for Knowledge work that we do. So thank you for that. Right now, we're going to have a short break to get the latest on what's going on in the markets, and then when we come back, we're going to be talking to Susie Stannard about the impact of all of that wet weather and grass growth and how it has been driving the milk market.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bonser, Senior Analyst at AHDB, with a look at grain and oilseed markets for the week commencing the 6th of January. Despite some support in wheat markets over the Christmas period, prices have been under pressure in the new year from a strengthening US dollar, technical selling and sluggish global demand. However, Russian wheat crop conditions remain in focus, with warmer than usual temperatures and excess moisture in key growing regions. Persistent hot and dry weather in Argentina is also raising concern over the country's maize crop, which is now in its critical development stage. For rapeseed, new crop prices are supported, with doubts over prospects for global rapeseed production in 2025, though forecasts of heavy soybean supplies from South America limit any major price increases. Over the next few weeks, weather in major exporting countries such as South America and Russia will be key in driving prices. The USDA will also release updated global supply and demand estimates at the end of this week. To stay up to date with the latest data and analysis across arable, red meat and dairy markets, head to hdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
If you're in the market for another podcast to subscribe to, then look no further than our Manager's Special, AHDB's Food and Farming podcast. Recent episodes include a consumer insight offering on red meat labels and supermarket aisles, as well as a dairy special about our work with retailers to promote milk. If you're after herbs, or rather herbal lays, our shelves are stacked with sage advice on how to introduce lucerne and clover into your fields. In fact, we cater for all tastes, so you'll find sections dedicated to all sectors: pork, cereals and oilseeds, dairy and beef and lamb. And don't forget our middle aisle, where you can often pick up a bargain episode you didn't know you needed to listen to. Search Food and Farming wherever you get your podcasts. AHDB thanks you for your custom.
Welcome back to Agronomics, where we are talking about grass and now dairy. So before the break, Katie was talking about Forage for Knowledge, a really important project. I suppose another plug to sign up for the newsletter. If something of interest to you, really important area to understand. And now we're going to sort of take all of that and sort of start to understand, well, what has that meant for the dairy industry this season? I'm pleased to introduce Susie Stannard. Welcome to the podcast, Susie. Just want to introduce yourself and then we can get into the details.
Thanks, Jack. I'm Susie Stannard and I am the lead analyst in the market specialist team for dairy. So my role essentially means looking at all the sort of supply and demand factors which influence what dairy markets are doing and therefore what prices farmers are getting to help our lead feed payers make better decisions.
And I suppose the sort of the key first question, we've had a huge amount of weather over the last few months, and I guess particularly for those running grass-based systems, even into other systems as well, the weather can do something and businesses can often feel snookered by the weather. But I think it's important that we understand what's going on and what it all means. So I guess in a nutshell, what has all this meant for milk production in the UK this year?
So I think there's been a number of factors, and probably to echo what Katie was saying, that very wet weather that we had right the way through, such a consistent long wet period, really had a lot of impact for farmers. So particularly in terms of the ability to get cows out on the ground, turnout was very late or limited, difficulty getting machines onto the land as well to actually be able to do some of that preparation work. So applying fertiliser, doing weed control, all of those jobs that farmers need to be getting on with in the spring couldn't happen till quite late. And then issues with poaching as well on the ground that did get sort of utilised. That's all had a big impact. And I think a big impact that we haven't probably talked about is in terms of morale. And I think actually farmers found it really, really difficult this year. There's been a number of economic challenges as well in terms of, input prices being a lot less high than they were previously, but still, at much higher levels than we've seen, a few years ago. And I think farmers have really struggled because of that. And then what that's really meant in terms of milk production is we've just seen milk production being back a little bit, so by 1% year on year, which doesn't sound like a huge amount, but actually we know that the markets are so finely balanced that 1% this way or that way can actually have a really big impact on then, what happens to markets and what they're doing. So that 1% year to date for GB equates to about 41 million litres. That is definitely having an impact on what markets are going to be doing.
Katie was talking about, I guess, from sort of June onwards, the weather was being a little bit kinder. And I guess we could be thankful that we've not had a hot, dry summer, which would have absolutely tanked grass production after a really challenging spring, and now preparing for what we might see as a bit of an autumn flush of grass. So is there a chance that we're down 1% with more normal production? Is there a chance that things might start to catch themselves up a bit as we sort of get into the back end of the grazing season, do you think? Or do you think a lot of damage has already been done?
Well, production in the summer hasn't looked quite so bad in terms of, when we're looking at sort of July, June time, it was back more like sort of 0.2%. But we have to remember there, we're annualising against the previous year, where the previous June was very hot, dry period, and the cows were subject to quite a bit of heat stress. Grass wasn't growing so well. So actually, the fact that we were still back compared to the previous year, things are sort of worse than they look like on paper, if you like. That being said, when we look at our sort of forecast, we're expecting things to still be back by a fair bit year on year. So, our outlook for the whole of the milk year is to be back by -1%. So we're not expecting production to come surging ahead. Though we never quite know, because sometimes, things can surprise us. And I think following the drought a couple of years back, we saw a huge sort of surge in the autumn that kind of did save the day. But I don't think we're expecting to see that happening this year, certainly. So I think probably a lot of the damage has been already done.
We can think about the UK and we can internalise about what's happening in the UK. But the reality is that most farming businesses are producing commodities and operating in global commodity markets. And I suppose that's where it sort of takes us next, is sort of what's been happening on the world stage that's impacting things here from a production point of view.
Other markets have been struggling a little bit with production as well, although probably for different reasons. It's not necessarily just the weather that's kind of playing an impact. So if you take Ireland in particular, they've probably been hit by the weather as well as quite a raft of environmental regulations, which I think is having quite a big impact on production. So, and because we're so close to Ireland, we have such a, symbiotic sort of trading relationship, that does have quite a big influence. But Irish production has been back by sort of double digits for quite a bit of the year. And I think that's probably having a bigger impact. So that lack of production that we've seen coming out of Ireland has meant a shortage of milk and a shortage of fats in particular, which is really starting to push up, well, more than starting, it really has pushed up the butter and the cream prices, which is really having a big impact. The EU is probably the market that's done the best at the moment, putting Ireland aside. EU is up by 0.9% year on year. But there is a bit of a trend which is happening at the moment for production to move in an easterly direction. Markets like Poland, for example, where they're a bit less subject to kind of environmental regulations domestically, milk supply is up by 4.3%, while Ireland is down by 5.9%. So You can just see this ongoing sort of shift. So I think that's one to watch. If we take global production in the whole, it's back by 0.5% at the moment. Decline in the US, they've had quite a shrinking herd going on, which is playing a role. Decline in New Zealand and Argentina particularly have seen quite a big drop off in milk production, which has been a couple of factors. One has been a result of the weather, as ever, but they've had a particularly severe drought. But also the economic situation in Argentina has been pretty severe. We talk about our inflation. They really have had galloping inflation, which has meant that, it's not really been worth the farmers' while to produce in the same way.
You talked about inflation there, and clearly from a consumption point of view, the world's consumers have been subject to a huge amount of inflation, and we're I guess coming out the other side of that. But what are the prospects looking like for global dairy demand?
Well, global demand is currently very strong because of that tightening of supply that we've already talked about. We often talk about the summer being a bit of a time of silly season. A lot of the traders have gone on holiday and the markets can be quite quiet. We don't necessarily expect lots to happen. But for example, I've been on holiday for a week and, it feels like all hell's broken loose with what's happening with markets at the moment, which is has been an ongoing trend in terms of, we talked about this shortage of supply in fats. And it's fats particularly that seems to be the engine which is really driving prices upwards. So if you take a few figures, Dutch butter, for example, is up by €630 per tonne in the last 3 weeks. And that's already sort of lifting up from a high base. So those are some big sort of movements. And in fact, we think that they're reaching some of the record highs that we've ever seen. The highest we saw butter at really was back in 2017. And we think when we do our latest iteration of the wholesale survey that we might even be exceeding that. Butter is now pulling cream up as well. Cream's also pushing up. So now we're looking at sort of, 285 to 290 compared to a previous high of 286. So some big, very big numbers. All of that is offset by the fact that powders are looking quite cheap at the moment and have been for some time. So, the value of milk is very much influenced by the value of fats at the moment rather than the other constituents. So, and then cheese really is sort of following on. It's a bit of a rising tide and cheese isn't hitting those record highs, but it is sort of following upwards. So some quite healthy demand going on a global basis. UK demand, certainly in retail, things are looking a lot better than they have been. We all know that UK consumers have been really impacted by the cost of living challenges and have been, keeping their volumes down where they can. Dairy is very much a staple, which puts us in good stead. However, it has had some volume challenges. So total dairy now in the latest 12-week period, according to Nielsen data, are up by 0.6% in volume terms. We have seen ongoing deflation across the category, I think in pretty much all commodities, which is really sort of helping things. Butter still looks pretty expensive. So butter is back in terms of volume by 3.8%. Liquid milk's back by 0.7%. However, if you look at some of the other products like cheese is up by 4.6% year on year, cream's up by 0.7%, and yoghurt is undergoing a bit of a renaissance. Yoghurt is up by 10% year on year, which is some pretty decent movements.
I think that is the most jam-packed podcast of information that we've ever done. So a huge thank you to Susie and to Katie for all of that. I think there's some good elements of positivity in there. A couple of, I guess, things. One is, how's the maize harvest going to go? And then how do we compete in the global market with the prices that are there? So some watch points. Feels like there are some points to be positive around there as well.
My favourite part was a yoghurt renaissance. It's a great phrase. I'm taking that. Right, Jack, question. Mystery word. Did you get it? I'm going to straight up. I didn't.
No, I didn't get yours either. No.
Useless. Utterly useless. I thought I completely signposted mine. I don't know how I managed to get this in, but it was Old Kent Road.
Oh, of course. I was just drawn into the Monopoly thing. Amended mine slightly. It was snooker, but I went for snookered because I could stitch it in with the weather thing a bit. So there we go. There needs to be some kind of formal. I need like a podcast VAR kind of thing here. That's a football thing.
Versus Old Kent Road. Definitely not fair.
So at the beginning, David, we talked about fancy football farmers. Yeah. So I suppose this clearly sets out that we need a referee, a farming referee for this.
I know who it should be. So we need someone independent, don't we? Mm-hmm. Independent, well respected, experienced, no bias. AHDB chairman Nicola Sapphire.